Today, we're going to talk about a case that took place in the 1980s. It was originally an unsolved cold case, but almost 30 years later, after a detective studied the case in detail, he decided to reopen the investigation, and that decision finally led to a breakthrough. This is the case of Karin Strom. The protagonist of this story was named Karin Strom, and she was 25 years old that year. Karin was outgoing and very popular with her friends. She lived in Woods Cross, Utah, USA. Woods Cross is a city in Davis County, Utah, and is located next to the Great Salt Lake. Karin was raised by her father, and when she was in high school, she met Steve. The two fell in love at first sight and immediately became sweethearts. They married right after graduating from high school, and like many newlyweds, their life was very sweet and happy at first. However, as time went on, this happy life did not last. Their feelings gradually faded and cracks appeared. 3 or 4 years into the marriage, Karin could no longer tolerate living like this. She decided to separate and moved to her stepmother's house. On June 5, 1980, Karin's husband Steve had called her a few days earlier. He said he wanted to bring Karin back home and invited her to have dinner together. Since that day was Karin's birthday and their wedding anniversary was coming up, Karin agreed to her husband Steve's request. The two of them had dinner together that evening and then went back home together. Steve worked the night shift at a factory near the Great Salt Lake from 12:30 midnight to 7 a.m. He rested at home for a while and then went out to work at the factory, while his wife Karin stayed at home overnight. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Steve got off work. He called home to remind his wife to get up for work, but no one answered the phone. He called several times and still nobody answered. Steve began to worry, because at that time, Karin should have been answering the phone. Concerned that something might have happened to his wife, he immediately drove back home. After he got home, Steve first went to the kitchen to see if Karin had left him a note, telling him where she had gone. However, Steve found no note. He then went to the bedroom, pushed open the door, and was stunned by what he saw. Karin was lying on the floor face up, and her neck was covered in blood. Steve was terrified. He quickly picked up the phone and called the police. The police arrived at the scene just a few minutes after receiving the call. But it was too late. Karin had unfortunately died. Investigators quickly entered the scene to survey and collect evidence. Karin was wearing pajamas, lying on the floor face up, with her feet against the wall and her head near the corner of the bed. There were obvious ligature marks on her throat. In addition, there were scratch marks on her neck, arms, and other parts of her body. In the bedroom, the blanket and sheet from the bed were on the floor, and the pillow had been thrown off the bed. The television had fallen from the cabinet onto the floor, still plugged in, with the screen still lit. The bed in the bedroom was made of brass, and 2 brass rods on the headboard had been broken off, with one completely on the floor. The police concluded that there had been a violent struggle in the room. Except for the bedroom, no other parts of the house showed signs of damage. The back door of Karin's house was a sliding door, with a stick wedged in to block the door, making it impossible to get in from the outside. The lock on the front door was intact, and the windows were undamaged. Police deduced that Karin may have let the killer into the house herself, or that the killer had a key to the house. After entering the house, the killer and Karin had a violent struggle. The injuries on Karin's arms showed that she fought back vigorously. In the end, the killer strangled Karin with both hands, causing her death. Police initially determined that this was a crime committed by someone she knew. investigators began questioning Karin's relatives and friends. Some said that Karin and her husband Steve had recently had some marital disputes. Steve admitted that there were problems in his marriage with Karin and that they had been separated for some time. During this time, Karin lived with her stepmother, but recently, the two were trying to reconcile. On the night of the crime, he had invited Karin to dinner to celebrate, and their relationship had greatly improved. Steve's statement was partially corroborated by Karin's stepmother. The stepmother said that Karin did agree to have dinner with Steve that day, but that the two were not trying to reconcile. The stepmother said that Karin had told her she planned to ask Steve for a divorce. The stepmother had long seen that the marriage was beyond repair, so she tried to persuade Karin not to go. But Karin said they were just having a meal. It wouldn't affect her decision to divorce, and she could use this dinner to tell Steve she wanted a divorce. After listening to the stepmother's testimony, investigators felt that Steve's motive for committing the crime had greatly increased, so they questioned Steve again. This questioning greatly surprised the police. Steve said he knew who the killer was, and that it was Karin's new boyfriend, Buff. Steve knew that after they separated, Karin had been seeing Buff, and when she was feeling down, she would go to Buff to vent. The two had a very good relationship. Steve said that Buff might have been jealous that he and Karin were getting back together, and in a fit of rage, killed Karin. The police immediately brought in Karin's boyfriend, Buff. Buff cooperated fully with the investigation and said he had nothing to do with the case. He said he wanted Karin to do what she wanted, and he had once told her to give Steve another chance. Karin's relatives and friends said they all felt that Karin and Steve's relationship was bad, and that when Karin was with Buff, her face was always full of smiles. Her relatives said that Buff could not have harmed Karin. The jealous one should have been her husband Steve, not Buff. Buff had an alibi for the night of the crime, so the police ruled him out as a suspect. By this point in the investigation, the coroner's autopsy report had come out. Limited by the technology of the time, the coroner could not determine a very specific time of death. They could only estimate it by the level of digestion of the food in the victim's stomach and the time she had eaten. The coroner estimated that Karin's time of death was between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. the next morning. Steve's shift that night started at 12:30 a.m., but he seemed to have been a bit late that day. He clocked in at 12:45 a.m., and it took 25 to 30 minutes to get from the house to the factory, so it wasn't too far. Based on the coroner's estimated time window for the murder, Steve could have committed the crime before going to work and then gone to the factory. Steve's colleagues said that Steve acted normally when he came to work that night. There was nothing unusual about his behavior. At this point, Steve provided the police with another suspect, his co-worker, Owens. Steve and Owens often drank, hunted, and fished together. The two were very good friends. Steve told the police that he thought Owens was very suspicious. Owens worked at the same factory as Steve. Steve worked the night shift. Owens worked the swing shift. So Owens had time to commit the crime. So the police went to find Owens. And they did find something. Owens had numerous small scratches on his arms and face, which looked very much like he had been clawed by someone. This greatly increased the police's suspicion of him. However, Owens explained that the scratches were caused by being scraped by metal shavings at work. The factory manager said that when working with machine tools, it was common for metal shavings to fly off and scrape you. As for the scratches on his face, he said that he was bending down to pick something up while working that day and accidentally bumped his head against equipment, causing the injury. On the night of the crime, After getting off work, Owens went to a bar with some co-workers for drinks, and they played a little pool. They drank from 8 p.m. until 4 a.m. when the bar closed. Owens said he returned to the factory at around 4:30 a.m., so he had an alibi. The co-workers who went to the bar with Owens confirmed this. Investigation showed that this Owens had little connection with Karin, and their paths in life rarely crossed. The police really could not find a motive for Owens to commit the crime, so they also ruled him out as a suspect. Following police procedures, Owens's DNA and hair samples were kept, and the injuries on his body were photographed for evidence. At this point in the investigation, both of the suspects Steve had provided had been ruled out. Therefore, the police had reason to believe Steve was lying. He not only had inconsistent statements, but also had ample motive. In addition, Steve had no alibi, and during the time period of Karin's death, he may not yet have gone to work. In theory, he had plenty of time to commit the crime. Subsequently, the county prosecutor issued an arrest warrant, and Steve was charged with first-degree murder. The police felt more than 50% confident that they could win the case. In court, all the evidence related to the case was presented one by one. However, all of the evidence was circumstantial. There was no strong, direct proof. In December 1980, the case was adjudicated. The court found the defendant Steve not guilty of first-degree murder and released him in court. Karin's family members were disappointed with this outcome. With the court's verdict, the case suddenly sank like a stone and became an unsolved mystery. However, Karin's sister Coco did not give up. She continued to search for evidence, hoping that one day the truth would come to light. Time passed until 2006, 26 years after the case occurred. Karin's sister Coco came to the police station to inquire about the progress of the case. Over the past 26 years, she had come to the police station like this from time to time. In fact, the police had almost given up on this old case. A detective named Benson was moved by Coco's persistence, and he began to try to understand the bloody case that had occurred 26 years earlier. After some research, Benson submitted a request to his superiors, hoping to be allowed to reinvestigate the case. Coco found Detective Benson, and the two worked together to search for new evidence. The superiors approved the request, and the case was officially reopened in January 2007. Detective Benson re-examined all the physical evidence from that year. He saw Karin's fingernails from that time and thought there might be the killer's DNA under them. In 1980, when the crime happened, DNA technology had not been used to solve cases, so Karin's fingernails had not been tested for DNA. So Detective Benson sent the fingernails to a laboratory for DNA testing. While waiting for the test report, Benson called one of the suspects from back then, Owens, to tell him that the case was being reopened and that he had some questions. On the phone, Owens was extremely uneasy. He avoided many of Benson's questions, which made Benson vaguely feel that Owens might know something about the case. The DNA report results confirmed Benson's suspicions. Under Karin's fingernails were the DNA of both Owens and Steve. Benson then asked the coroner to reassess Karin's time of death. Using more advanced technology, the coroner analyzed the changes in body temperature and ambient temperature recorded at the time and concluded that Karin's time of death was around 12:30 a.m. Steve had clocked in at work at 12:45 a.m. that night, and it took at least 25 minutes to commute from home to the factory. The timing definitely didn't allow for him to commit the crime, so Steve could basically be ruled out as a suspect. And Owens had an alibi. he had been drinking at a bar from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. So why was Owens's DNA under Karin's fingernails? Detective Benson went to find the co-workers who had drunk with Owens that night. According to their recollection, Owens was indeed at the bar with them that night, but they could not be certain that he had been there the entire night. It was possible that Owens had left in the middle and then returned. No one had seen Owens in the bar for the entire time. Detective Benson looked at the photographs of Owens's injuries taken in 1980. The wounds did not look like they were caused by machinery, but more like scratches from someone's hands. At this point, the police believed Owens was a major suspect and wanted to bring him back to the police station for questioning. However, the police were a step too late. Owens had left a farewell letter for his wife, saying he would never come back. Owens had fled to avoid punishment. His credit card records showed that he had fled to San Antonio, Texas, and from there to Mexico, plunging the case into a stalemate. In March 2007, the case had a new turn. The police received a message that Owens had run out of money and could no longer live in Mexico, so he had to return to the United States. When Detective Benson learned the news, he immediately called Owens and said, "I have enough evidence to apply for an arrest warrant, and I advise you to surrender as soon as possible." Owens had nowhere to run, so he came to the police station and turned himself in. He would face a charge of first-degree murder. Owens's family hired a lawyer to defend him. As soon as he arrived, the lawyer raised a sharp point. The DNA under Karin's fingernails was not skin cells, but semen. So this was not a murder case, but an attempted sexual assault case. As for why Owens fled to Mexico, the lawyer said that Owens had just gone to Texas to see a friend, and then to a town on the Mexican border to have some fun. It was there that he learned he might be facing a murder charge in Utah, so he returned to the country. It wasn't because he had run out of money. Due to insufficient evidence, the prosecution dropped the case against Owens and he was released. Detective Benson went over all the physical evidence from 1980 again and again. He hoped to find even a trace of strong evidence among the items. The police gathered the evidence to take photographs and then used a computer to digitize these photos so as not to miss the tiniest detail. Through Detective Benson's unremitting efforts, he finally found an almost invisible, small red dot on one of Karin's pieces of clothing. Upon examination, it looked like a drop of blood. Detective Benson immediately contacted the laboratory and asked them to test whether there was DNA evidence in the spot. This drop of blood was decades old, and it would be very difficult to test it. Yet a few days later, the test results showed that the drop of blood belonged to Owens. With such powerful evidence, the police brought a new case against Owens in March 2009. In court, faced with one piece of solid evidence after another, Owens finally admitted his crime. On May 21, 2009, at Owens's sentencing hearing, the event took another turn. Owens made an admission that no one dared to believe. He said that although he had killed Karin, the mastermind behind the whole thing was Karin's husband, Steve. A few months earlier, Steve had asked him to do it. At that time, he did not agree. Later, Steve bought life insurance for his wife, Karin. If anything happened to Karin, Steve would receive a hefty payout. Steve promised Owens that if the plan succeeded, he would give Owens half of the insurance money. Steve gave Owens a key to the house. In the early hours of June 6, 1980, Owens used this key to open the door. After entering, he did not immediately act, but instead tried to persuade Karin to leave quickly. Telling her that Steve wanted to kill her, and that she should run away. Karin did not believe him, scolded him, and told him to get out. Then the two argued, and Owens eventually strangled her with his hands. At the hearing, Steve naturally denied everything Owens had said. A police investigation found that Steve did indeed buy an insurance policy for his wife. This policy was a factory benefit with a coverage of $50,000. There was no evidence linking this policy to Karin's case, so the prosecution did not file charges against Steve. In the end, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury unanimously found the defendant Owens guilty of first-degree murder. From the time it occurred to its conclusion, this case took 29 years. If it hadn't been for Detective Benson's decision to reopen the investigation, it would have remained a cold case forever. It's somewhat regrettable that even though the case has been solved, we still don't know if Owens was telling the truth or whether Steve was actually the mastermind behind the crime.